guys, it's Jane and welcome to Mystery Monday. Now, seeing as how this is my first Mystery Monday, I thought it would be a good idea to give a general introduction and introduce some of my terminology. In following weeks, I'm looking at doing some book recommendations and reviews and who knows, whatever takes my fancy that's connected to mystery. But for today, a general tour of the genre. And I hope that will be useful, particularly for readers who might be somewhat new to mystery fiction. Now, before I go any further, I should explain my first bit of terminology, the way that I'm using mystery and crime fiction. Now, my understanding is that the term mystery fiction is the default name for the genre in North America. In Britain and in the British diaspora, of which Australia is a part, crime fiction is more commonly used. Both these terms are a little bit tricky. They can be misinterpreted. Mystery fiction sometimes is used as the name for a subgenre where there are supernatural elements. And crime fiction is sometimes used to name a subgenre where the protagonist of the story is the criminal rather than the investigator, which is more normal. Crime can also be taken to mean non-fiction writing about crime, but that's not how I'm using it. For me, mystery fiction and crime fiction I'm going to use pretty much interchangeably just to refer to the whole genre. And I'm using mystery in the title because it goes with Monday. So what is crime fiction? Typically, a crime fiction story is one which is driven by the investigation of a crime. Most typically of all, it's a murder. The protagonist is somebody who is trying to work out who done it. In the course of their investigation, previously hidden relationships and motivations and resentments will come to light on the part of almost all of the characters in the story, and almost all of the characters of the story are going to be suspects at some point. The story closes with the criminal being brought to justice in some form by the action of the protagonist. Things are learnt, justice is done, and the case is closed. Well, that's the typical story arc anyhow. The range of mystery fiction stories can roughly be mapped across 3 dimensions: protagonist, atmosphere, and setting. In crime fiction, the protagonist is almost always an investigator of the crime. I did mention earlier, there is a small subgenre of reverse mystery fiction where the protagonist is the criminal, but that is much less common. To a large extent, the type of story that's being told is determined by who the author has chosen as their investigative protagonist. The police procedural is a story where the investigator is a police officer, or as commonly a group of police officers. This is usually part of an ongoing series which follows the ups and downs and the politics internal to that particular branch of law enforcement. It might actually be the FBI or something, not strictly speaking police, but it's a procedural. The other thing that's special about police procedurals is quite often there is more than one crime being investigated at the same time. Another common type of story is what I call a detective story. That is that the protagonist is a private investigator. Again, these stories normally come in the form of an ongoing series where the private life and history and demons of the protagonist investigator form quite a large part of the meat of the story, if not the actual plot. Then there are a large number of stories which feature citizen sleuths. Possibly this person is part of an allied profession, although not actually law enforcement themselves. They might be a lawyer, they might be a coroner, they might be a journalist, or possibly they might be a retired law enforcement professional. They might just be a person with a knack for seeing things that other people don't. There are a range of common tropes in this area. We have the doctor, we have the little old lady, we have a clergy person, and don't ask me why, but there's lots of stories where these are cooks, and also, forgive me, there are cat detectives. Yes, cat detectives are a thing. There's one last kind of protagonist in mystery stories, and this is the only one that doesn't almost invariably come in continuing series. This is the innocent bystander as investigator protagonist. Now, I have coined that term pretty much, or at least I'm using it in this context. I looked, but I couldn't actually find a catch-all term that's accepted usage for this type of story. If you know what it is, please tell me down below and I'll start using that. But for the time being, innocent bystander. The innocent bystander is drawn into investigating the mystery because the crime affects them personally and they feel in danger, either from the unknown criminal or from law enforcement. They are being wrongly suspected. This motivates them to try and solve the crime themselves. Innocent bystander stories are almost always standalones, and that makes them quite unusual in the crime fiction genre. Turning to atmosphere, crime fiction covers quite a range from the dark and gritty to the light and fluffy. If we start at the light and fluffy end of the spectrum, one type of crime fiction is the traditional or puzzle or whodunit story, most epitomised by Agatha Christie. In these, the crime itself is usually described in a fairly bloodless way, and while there may be moments of tension in the story, those are quite light. Cosy is another term which is used in a range of ways in crime fiction. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with traditional, but for my money, a true cosy mystery is one that's even further down the light and fluffy road than Agatha Christie. Cosy mysteries do not strive in any way for realism. They often have punny titles, female protagonists, romantic subplots. They are written entirely for entertainment purposes. Also on the lighter side, there are some bumbling detective stories, think Inspector Clouseau, and there are caper stories in which the crime, normally not murder, is carried out in a comical and sometimes incompetent manner. When we move to the darker or more realistic side of the genre, we come across the hard-boiled crime fiction. In a hard-boiled story, the investigator is almost always male and either a private detective or a police officer. The investigator himself is usually implicated in some sort of shady dealings, and the whole world of the story is peopled with bad apples of different shapes and sizes. There is violence, there is gunplay, and there is blood in a hard-boiled story. In fact, the pursuit of justice in a hard-boiled story is often seen as being motivated by mercenary or quixotic impulses. Noir, which is a term taken from the movies, is often used interchangeably with hard-boiled, but strictly speaking, it indicates a particular kind of inner urban setting. Hard-boiled stories are often stylish, but finally kind of depressing. Soft-boiled is a less frequently used term, but it's a very useful one. Soft-boiled stories are similar to hard-boiled ones in their realistic view of crime and society, but they hold a somewhat more upbeat view of the world at large. Often soft-boiled stories deal with social conditions and vulnerable people groups who are seen as being victims of circumstances, not just corrupt, although some members of those groups may well indeed be corrupt. Soft-boiled protagonists are often, though not necessarily, female. Two other terms as far as atmosphere goes which are important are suspense, which usually means tension and psychological danger, and thriller, which means action and physical danger. Now, the other dimension for plotting out crime fiction is setting. Because of the nature of the mechanics of a crime fiction story, they're often used to carry out a close investigation of a particular subgenre or historical period. You can find a historical mystery set in almost any historical period you care to name. If you can think of a historical period without a resident detective, then you have actually probably found a way to turn quite a nice profit. Another common setting trope is the village. A quiet English country village, or its foreign equivalent, is almost as frequent a setting for a crime fiction story as a seedy urban undercity. Finally, before I finish, there are 3 other kinds of books that I want to talk about and mention because they have things in common with mystery fiction, but they're usually considered as being not part of the genre. The first is spy stories. Spy stories often have crimes and investigations involved, but the overall thrust of the story is usually looking at something a bit more high level than in a crime story. Then there are urban fantasy stories. Urban fantasy stories unusually often centre around a detective type character and have crime type story arcs. However, they are usually not considered part of crime fiction. And the last one is true crime, which is a non-fiction retelling of crimes that happen in the real world. I am not an aficionado of true crime. I've read very little of that, and I'm not going to be talking about that on Mystery Mondays. So, why is it that people read crime fiction? Now, one definition of a mystery story, which I came across when I was doing my research to make this video, is that a mystery story is a story in which something happens. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it does get across one important idea, and that is that in a mystery story, plot is king. Crime fiction readers are almost always people who are interested and care about plot. A good crime fiction story never has a sloppy plot, unless it was written by Raymond Chandler. And the man is a magician and he makes you not care, and he is the exception that proves the rule. Arguably, the second most important element in a crime fiction story is setting. As I've already said, the mechanics of a crime fiction story lend themselves to doing a critical analysis of a particular setting, and that might be an exotic setting or one that's seemingly familiar to the intended readership. A crime fiction story can put it under the microscope and make you see it in a slightly different way. Coming a close third in importance is character. The victims, the suspects, and even most particularly sometimes the protagonist are all people who are put to the test in a mystery story, and that means you get a view of them which is different to how you would see them in another kind of story. As for the fourth door to reading, writing itself, well, it's probably only fair to say that with crime fiction, your mileage may vary. If you're a person who is only looking for the absolute greatest in prose, there are indeed crime writers who I could recommend for you, but the crime fiction genre as a whole may not be for you. I'm sorry. I'll wave to you while you're over there in the literary fiction shelves. The biggest reason, however, that people like to read crime fiction is it's a way of dealing with the fact that the world we live in is broken. Bad things happen, and sometimes bad things even happen to good people. We hate this, and our inner 3-year-old wants to jump up and down and say, it's not fair. We have an innate desire as human beings to see that justice is done, and that is the payoff in mystery fiction. It may be complicated, It may be messy, it's usually only partial, but in mystery fiction, things get fixed. And we all want that. And that's what I think is the biggest reason why people like reading crime fiction. Well, that's all from me for now. Next week on Mystery Monday, I'm going to bring you some favourites and recommendations across the spectrum of mystery fiction. Until then, I hope you're all well, and I'll talk to you later. Bye!